And they came away with a fixed royalty per tonne. And certainly their revenues from oil increased quite substantially throughout the 1930s afterwards.
The Iranians had renegotiated the deal, but they were still convinced that Britain had ultimate control.
گمان من اینه که رضا شاه از عاقبت کار اندیشه کرد، یعنی که بیمناک شد که دولت انگلیس کوشش بکنه برای برانداختن سلطنتش و چون او هم مثل هموطنانش یا مثل خیلی از هموطنانش به قدرت لایزال و جادویی انگلیس اعتقاد داشت.
کلماتی که بعد از نان و آب و گوشت و این چیزا شنیدم از فارسی یاد گرفتم. موقعی زبان باز کردم شنیدم، هرچی شنیدم بله کار انگلیس هاست. نخست وزیر تازه می آمد تو خانواده، مجالس و محافلی که به هر حال اونایی که من اجازه داشتم بشنوم یعنی مال خانوادگی، همه نخست وزیر جدید بله مال خودشونه. این معزول میشد، انگلیس ها راضی نبودن.
خب اونا میخوان با خراب کردن اسم من انتقام شکستاشونو بگیرن. از کجا معلومه که منو سربه نیست نکنن؟ با این خبرهای جنگ که هر روز تو روزنامه ها و رادیو هست، خب مسلما دوباره به ایران لشکر کشی میکنن. منم که دیگه کاره ای نیستم جلوشونو بگیرم.
In World War II, the German army had almost reached Moscow. Fearing the loss of Iran's oil fields, in 1941, Russia and Britain invaded.
There was no doubt in our mind that the Germans expected to take the refinery and the oil fields intact because they never bombed it. It was a mystery why there was never any attempt to overfly the place, let alone bomb it, during the war, and it could only have been that they thought it was a plum that would drop into their laps.
By the time of the war, Reza Shah had become unpopular. His autocratic approach had alienated his people. So when Britain and Russia occupied Iran, Reza Shah abdicated and went into exile.
خودش تصمیم گرفت که استعفا بده و ایران رو ترک کنه. خیلی ها گمان میکنن که انگلیس بهش فشار آورد که این کار رو بکنه یا اولتیماتوم داد که این کار رو بکنه. اسناد و مدارک و اطلاعات موجود چنین چیزی رو نشون نمیده، چه ایرانی چه انگلیسی.
What's interesting about the whole Reza Shah period is that while the initial British ministers in Iran were very fond of Reza Shah, they saw him as the strong man to come and reform the country. It did not take very long for the British to fall out of love with Reza Shah. They didn't like him and he didn't particularly like them. They found him quite brutish, a little bit vulgar. Of course, from the Iranian side, they argued that the British would naturally go against him because he was such a nationalist. By the end of the 1930s, he was proving increasingly unpopular within Iran itself. There was a thesis developed in Britain that Reza Shah was moving towards the Nazis. Plans were put into operation to weaken the government of Reza Shah.
The BBC Persian services suddenly changed tack on the eve of the Anglo-Russian invasion of Iran and accused Reza Shah of being a bloodthirsty dictator that had to be gotten rid of.
Reza Shah's son, Mohammad Reza, took over from his father, and he would always blame the British for his father's downfall. With Reza Shah gone, the press and political parties flourished, including a new communist party. But Iran's relations with Britain would overshadow politics once more, and again oil would be the bone of contention.
The situation by then was Abadan was the biggest refinery anywhere in the world. There were probably about 2,500 British expatriates living there, and there were probably about 75,000 Iranians working for BP in Iran, and most of those would have been at Abadan. So it's a pretty sizable community.
Abadan, a modern township of tidy streets and roomy houses. English-looking houses with neat gardens and spacious lawns.
The company did everything. It maintained the housing, it fed us, it looked after our health, it looked after the water supply, the hygiene, everything. Everything that we depended upon, came from the company.
Rugby football was not forgotten, and though it was many miles from Twickenham, the rules were just as strictly observed.
It was said that if you could get together an interest group, the company would provide the facilities. They were marvellous in the way they looked after us from that point of view. Golf clubs, golf courses, swimming pools, tennis courts, squash courts. If you wanted it, the company would provide it.
But conditions for the Iranians, who made up the majority of the workforce, weren't so salubrious. Even the best educated were kept in junior positions.
Now, of course, in the case of this particular oil operation, I mean, you have a managerial hierarchy that quite quickly developed to run the operation, and that was a necessity to run the operation. But, of course, the more senior positions were held by Brits. So, actually, the notion of sort of inferiority, if there is one, towards, say, Iranians or Persians, is sort of reinforced by the fact that actually in the workplace, they occupy the more junior positions.
The Iranians were increasingly resentful of British arrogance. And now the Russians too were demanding oil concessions.
شوروی از ایران تقاضا کرده بود که در 5 استان شمالیش بهشون امتیاز نفت شمال داده بشه، معادل یعنی نوعی تعادل با امتیاز نفت جنوب که انگلیس‌ها داشتن. و یادتون باشه اون موقع شوروی هنوز ارتشش در ایران بود.
Now, Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist and a veteran of the constitutional revolution of 40 years before, returned to parliament.
ولی مصدق به خصوص در مجلس یک رول مهمی بازی کرد برای جلوگیری از این، به این معنا که یک طرح در مجلس به سرعت گذروند که مطابق اون طرح دولت ایران حق نداشت بدون تصویب مجلس هیچ گونه امتیازی به هیچ قدرت خارجی بده.
With oil dominating the political agenda, attention shifted to Britain's oil concession, with Mossadegh leading the opposition.
دکتر مصدق اینطوری بگیم، دکتر مصدق خواستار آزادی و استقلال ایران بود. به همین علت هم وقتی که می‌بینید ایشون رئیس کمیسیون نفته، قانون اصل ملی شدن نفت رو ایشون تحت عنوان به نام سعادت ایران تنظیم میکنه و ارائه میکنه به مجلس. میخواست این سلطه‌ای رو که استعمار بریتانیا در ایران و در خیلی کشورها برقرار کرده این از بین بره. ایرانی بود و میخواست به عنوان یک ایرانی عمل بکنه.
In 1951, Mossadegh became prime minister. The bill was passed and Iranian oil was nationalized, to great public acclaim. It was a seismic event in relations between Britain and Iran. The oil company retaliated by closing the refinery at Abadan.
It was just taken pretty much for granted that the oil was owned by the company. So, yes, I think each side...
Is that because they felt that they'd spent so much money and time and effort in order to discover, exploit and market it, that they felt that entitled them to ownership?
We've developed their oil industry. They couldn't have done it for themselves. That would have been BP's view, and probably actually would have been true.
As the deadlock remains unsolved, the refinery's output is cut by half. All supplies to ships have now ceased, and the last 2 tankers left Abadan during the weekend.
We tried to explain, look, if you expropriate this and send all the British technicians away, how are you going to earn your money? You can't eat the oil. Oil has to be marketed in order to get your money, and here are the tankers, and unfortunately they are tankers belonging to the big oil companies, so we have to have some agreement. No, he wouldn't understand that. Only interested in one thing, out.
The British airlift from Abadan came to a temporary halt at London Airport last weekend. Back to Britain came the last group of women and children from the Persian oil fields. The families of Anglo-Iranian employees, their arrival meant that more than 1,000 people, including many young babies, have now been brought back in special charter planes.
Oil was incredibly important to the balance of payments. Abadan was Britain's biggest foreign asset. So for the British government, as opposed to BP, there is a huge economic concern about the importance of oil, and a huge feeling that if the leader of a Middle East country is seen to just get away with nationalising this massive British asset, what's to stop other leaders doing the same thing?